when you walk into a room, I suppose, an Aboriginal person, there's all other Aboriginal people there. People, of course, always want to know where you're from, what mob you are, where you fit in. And so there's all that jostling, I suppose, of where your identity is, who you are, should we trust you, that type of thing. And I know this happens for everybody at some level, but I think this happens all the time, like when you're an Aboriginal person, in every social environment, even on a day-to-day basis, even if you know all the people.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Idioms of Normality. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Mason, and I'm joined today by Professor Suzi Hutchings, who is from the Arrernte Nation near Alice Springs in Australia and is currently working at Swinburne University. Suzi, welcome.
Hi, thank you. Nice to meet you, and thanks very much for offering me the opportunity to be interviewed on the book.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on Idioms of Normality. It's really fun to be interviewing the contributors of this volume, The Anthropology of Ambiguity. And tell me, how did you come to work on the topic of ambiguity?
To be honest, Tim and Mahanas, they actually just said that they were writing a book about ambiguity and would I be interested. So it was as basic as that, I suppose. But I was interested because it just resonated with my position, I suppose, as an Indigenous anthropologist working in Australia, and the constant, well, in the past more so than now, questions about are you really Aboriginal, and that sort of underlying idea that how could you possibly have reached this stage in your career and have done all this being Aboriginal. There's always a level of that, I think, in Australia. There's a level of racism throughout, I think, Australia. So just an opportunity to perhaps tackle some of this on an international stage through the book, I thought would be very useful, and I felt like I had some things to say that I hadn't said in other publications. I hadn't finished saying them, I should say. I'd said some of them in other publications, but I hadn't finished saying them, and this gave me that opportunity to actually say those things.
And I love the title, Liminal Ambiguity, the tricky position of being black in white skin. It's a great title, and I want to be asking you lots of questions about this pretty soon. But let me jump in first with the question that the series revolves around, and that is, what is normal?
Yeah, so in my mind, normal is, there is no such thing as normal, because you can be any sort of normal. And I was just reflecting on where I'm working at the moment, the Mundani Tumbul Centre, and it's the people who are working in that centre, we're a mix of all different nations, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal, and all diverse genders as well. And it just seems, we all just accept each other and get on with things. It's possibly other people who find that difficult, and that made me feel that this is normal. The difference is normal. The difference among us is normal.
I like that. The difference among us is normal. And I'm sure that my next question is going to tie into these complex identities that you want to explore in this chapter, but also in your work. Can you tell us what the phrase liminal ambiguity refers to?
Yes, it's because you're going in and out of it. So you're in a sort of a liminal space. You can be you're in a liminal space because you're jumping from one situation to another where you feel, as an Aboriginal person, that you feel comfortable, or you have to change the way you operate in another space. For instance, I suppose at PBS, the radio station where I'm currently doing this interview from, that everyone's incredibly accepting in this environment, and you can be whoever you like. And it is that sort of environment. But maybe like I described the situation on the tram, there, because of the way I look, people from externally assume of some certain things, like we all assume about each other, but they wouldn't necessarily know about my Aboriginal background. So that's a liminal space because because no one knows me, and I have the opportunity, I suppose, to play into that space and just be invisible almost. So it's a form of invisibility.
And I guess it was in anthropology circles, it was Victor Turner who made the phrase liminality so famous
Mm,
about those between and betwixt phases. But you're also critiquing that concept of liminality a bit too.
yes, because it doesn't actually account for exactly what I'm talking about. Whereas, because I think Turner's talking about going from one phase, one state of being in the social trajectory that people have the opportunity because of the society they're born into through that timeline of their life. Whereas when you're in a liminal space that I'm talking about, it's not about that, because you can go in and out of that space, and you don't. It's not a journey. You don't end up anywhere in
Ah,
terms
right.
of the, you haven't transformed into from a child to adult or whatever. You're still the same person, but it's the external environment that offers or enforces you to be in that liminal state.
That's interesting. So it's not a rite of passage, but there is a social demarcation there of sorts, whether or not someone is choosing to reveal or conceal or travel under the ambiguity or expose, I guess,
Mm.
certain parts of their identity or just travel under the assumptions.
Yes, that's right, exactly. Yeah. And so when I'm amongst, Aboriginal people or mob, you don't have that, because you are Aboriginal, so you're interacting culturally at that level
Yeah.
anyway. So there's no need to be liminal, and to fit in other ways. I mean,
There's
sure,
no,
there's the tension there still can be tension, obviously, because people might not get on, or there's family stuff going on, but that's different because it's within the existing culture.
Interesting. So it's the set of assumptions in that experience are very different, and you
Mm,
don't have to make the decision about, do I talk about this,
exactly.
relate in this way? Interesting.
Yeah.
How have these experiences influenced your academic perspectives?
Oh, that's a hard one. Do you mean, maybe can you just perhaps expand on that
Yes.
again?
So in your chapter, you share personal experiences that highlight the challenges of living with a fair-skinned Aboriginal identity. And I guess there's personal reflections about that, but there's also perhaps some professional reflections about that as well.
Oh, yes. Okay. Yes, in terms of the profession of anthropology, again, I think that there is that expectation that for some of people in my position, again, like I was talking about earlier before we started the interview, that you're not actually real. You're not a real Aboriginal person, or you're going native. That somehow you're not true to the cause or the profession of anthropology, because you've actually got inside knowledge that no one else has access to, or few people. I mean, there's obviously, I'm not the only Indigenous anthropologist, but it's not like there's a huge number of us out there. So yeah, so in a way, there's often, I've experienced the possibility that we can be a threat, because we have other knowledge. We have knowledge of Aboriginal community, Aboriginal family at a very intrinsic level that you can't ignore as an Aboriginal person. Whereas
Yeah, right.
non-Aboriginal people, so anthropologists, can never actually have that connection to that
Mm.
extent. Even if they're
Yeah,
given skin names and various other, even if they're accepted, they're still not actually really Aboriginal. And I know that people would argue against that. I know some anthropologists who would argue strongly against that, who are not Aboriginal. But this is, it's like it's something you can't escape from as an Aboriginal person. You are Aboriginal. You can't pretend you're not in that environment. Whereas non-Aboriginal anthropologists, for example, can, even though they have those kinship obligations and they get harassed or humbugged or whatever, they could still disappear or leave or something. They don't have that. The obligation, I would argue, is different. It's so hard
I
to
understand.
explain.
I I feel like I understand, and I want to check in with you that I'm making sense of this, in the sense that a non-Aboriginal person who walks in these circles and becomes integrated with community doesn't have the same kinds of kinship obligations that someone who is born into an Aboriginal family will have with not just their kin, but also their surroundings, right?
Yeah, because it's implicit. Even if you didn't grow up in that particular community for whatever reason, once you enter into that, then you suddenly gain all that. People want to teach you. They
Mm.
want to include you in that because you are actually kin. like your true kin.
Yeah, okay. When I think about this, I'm thinking about the kinship studies that I had to learn in my first year, and you can look at another society and you can look at the kinship structure and you can name all the different kin terms, and yes, you've got a surface understanding of it, but it's very different when so let's say we're studying a patrilineal matrilocal society, and you've got all the kinship terms, but if you are one of those kin, then your understanding is not just epistemological, but also ontological in the sense that you know that you will benefit from certain forms of inheritance and you will not benefit from other forms of inheritance. And so the lived experience of that knowledge is going to sit very differently.
Yes, exactly. And that's what I mean by you can't escape. It's not like you can take it off or write.
Yeah.
You can write about it, but you probably won't actually. We don't necessarily write about those things in the same way because it's almost slightly offensive to write about what's just real for you in that way.
That's interesting. It's slightly offensive to write about things that I can understand that. Like, there are practices where if you state the obvious, and everyone has an implicit understanding of the obvious within that social context, but if you were to state it, let's say you're drinking sake with friends who are Japanese, and you would say, "Oh, my cup is empty," that would be incredibly rude.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to infer it in other ways. So writing down my cup was empty while I was around my Japanese friends would be inferring that your friends had been rude to you or something. And there's from an anthropological position, you think you're just writing something very objective, but from a relational perspective, you're writing something quite abrupt and rude.
Yes, and sure, you might be then using it as a form of analysis, an example that you would analyse of how the society works.
Yeah.
So that's that's another tension of yes, as an anthropologist, I am expected to do some of that, particularly a native title, to explain how a particular culture works. Or for the more so that not necessarily just native title, but more so for the family court and the criminal court where I've done cultural reports, trying to translate that level of knowledge to a judge is really challenging. So I can do it in that context. Yeah,
that's fascinating because there are certain assumptions about what the nuclear family looks like under Australian law that would not necessarily make sense within.
And the judges, in my experience, really want to understand that to really get to the heart of why an Aboriginal child should be brought up by their mother, for example, or not their mother necessarily, their auntie, or for example, and not their father's kin, say in desert culture in Australia. So it's to try and then it's very challenging to try and describe that process or that understanding of kinship to a judge who doesn't have it really. I mean, an anthropologist would have some understanding of that, who's worked in Central Australia, for example, but a judge doesn't necessarily. They can only judge it according to often Western culture or whatever. So that becomes a challenge to actually explicate that difference in culture.
I want to pursue this further and ask you lots of questions about it, but I also don't want to be rude and stumble across questions that would be considered rude. And so I have to think of myself as a complete neophyte, a complete baby in this instance. And I'm open to being told, silly boy, don't ask those silly questions. But I've always been fascinated by the relationship between kinship systems and totemic systems and how they interlock or intersect with the way in which people would make sense of those affinities within their upbringing, whether they would move in with their auntie or their maternal auntie or whether they would move in with someone else. What's the relationship between kinship and totemic systems?
Oh, that's a really difficult one. And I think that's also a challenge for me because these are such anthropological terms. I've always, to be honest, struggled with understanding them academically rather than intrinsically on the ground and how it operates within people that I'm with and how that's determined, because I'm always positioned as an Aboriginal person in that environment too, regardless. I know non-Aboriginal anthropologists would argue they are as well, but for me it's always automatic because the moment I say who my family is, that means I'm already got a position in there. So there's a different level of understanding about those very things, and I suppose I've always struggled with the naming of it because that's not how I think because of the way the cultural implications of where I'm positioned in those societies that I go into.
That makes a lot of sense, because particularly when it comes to the word normal, I think it's really interesting, or the word normal, it's really interesting to see how we apply words from our own language that we don't even realize are inflected with cultural meaning. And so the point that you're making is really great, that what kinship and totem means to me will be completely off par to the lived experience of how that plays out on the ground between individuals, between family members.
And when it comes up and when it's relevant, because in the everyday, that in my experience, the actual kinship is far more important than the totemic in how you talk to each other. But that doesn't mean the totemic's not important, because that obviously overplays other aspects of life as you go out and, maybe collect bush foods or whatever. So that may then come into play, but not in terms of how you're interrelating with each other as you're going out doing those things. So it's only possibly you only reflect on it, if at all, actually reflect on it outside of yourself once that's all finished.
Can I be a little bit playful with you now? In the sense that in my observations of cultural observations of catching a tram in Melbourne, for example, when you're getting on a tram or you watch people get on a tram, often they're sort of scouring the space for where would be the most normal place for me to sit. And there's always this, there's a very particular spacing, and people are looking for markers of normality on other individuals, and this became very apparent to me on a tram in Melbourne once, when there was a homeless man who just had, it was quite a packed tram, but there was this whole bubble of space around this gentleman, a very noticeable bubble. And it was, and I didn't think about it. I just sat next to him and I realized there was no one else sitting near us. I was actually sitting just behind him, And it took me a while to figure out why the ends of the tram were quite packed, and then what was going on. But it became very apparent that people look for markers of normality as though it's a marker of safety, but it also is a marker of how I relate with people around me. And if my understanding of the Indigenous Australian experience is correct, then the markers that we're looking for are not the markers of normality between any two Indigenous people. The markers are primarily, would it be correct to say, are kin?
Yes.
So we're looking for a completely different constellation of markers of how to relate to each other. Can you flesh that out for us a little bit more?
Yeah. So no, that's great how you've reinterpreted what I was trying to articulate. When you walk into a room, I suppose, an Aboriginal person, there's all the other Aboriginal people there. People, of course, always want to know where you're from, what mob you are, where you fit in. But they don't necessarily say it up front like that. It's more subtle, and you get that eventually. You get that out, and people start to understand where you fit. And so there's all that jostling, I suppose, of where your identity is, who you are, should we trust you, that type of thing. And I know this happens for everybody at some level, and that's exactly what you're describing. But I think this happens all the time when you're an Aboriginal, constantly when you're an Aboriginal person, in every social environment, even on a day-to-day basis, even if you know all the people. It happens again. Each time I go back into where I work, there's an element of that happening, and everyone sort of slightly analyses that as you're going through the day, and but not in a bad way. This is all part of enjoying each other and enjoying each other's company as well. But you're always sort of thinking, is there sort of social background of being stolen generation? Is that impacting why they said those things? And or is it because they, come from, I don't know, New South Wales and have a particular experience, or Wiradjuri or whatever, in that cultural background? So, yeah, there's a level of analysis that goes on too.
For a cultural outsider like myself, it can feel, and this is a very naive perspective, so please forgive me here, and I'm wary of making mistakes, but in the sense that I know that I will make them, and please call me out on them. But I feel that it can feel, as a cultural outsider, it can feel like it's a little bit standoffish. But what I've learned, if I've learned anything, is that Indigenous Australians are looking for context markers much more readily than I'm trained to do through my cultural experiences.
I think that's what I'm trying to describe, actually. That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. I think that's fascinating that we're looking, from the Indigenous perspective, we're looking for context markers much more so than we do in the very individualistic Australian upbringing where we just look at the individual. Are they wearing shoes? Are they not wearing shoes? Are they wearing expensive clothing or cheap clothing? Are they well groomed? Are they not well groomed? Whereas that kind of gets thrown out the door because we're not just focused on the individual. We're also looking at that individual in relation to contextual features.
Yes.
Could you give us an example of that, maybe?
Well, I was just
how that plays out.
Well, I was just going to say, and goes to that question. Then in other situations, where it's not relevant, like where I am at the moment, you don't need to do that. So that's the ambiguity. You almost lose that because it's not as important. It is important, but it's not important to the other people around you because they don't get it. They don't necessarily know. Not that they don't get it, but they don't know, and so they're not. You can't operate at the same level. You can't, go up and say, where are you from? That type of thing. Like people would think that's a bit weird. Whereas you possibly can say that in...
Or rude.
Yeah, or rude. Yeah. And where's your mob or whatever, it's irrelevant in various different contexts. So that plays into the ambiguity that I was trying to get to in my chapter as well. So, and the liminality of that... I was just going to say the liminality of it is it's not stable. You're going from one situation to another, then you're back again. So you're constantly unsettled and liminal through society, except when you're with other Aboriginal people or First Nations people.
Is this part of the intellectual burden or the cognitive burden on Indigenous people to explain, those kinds of experiences and what other people don't even think to look for?
The other people as in...
non-Indigenous people.
Yeah, I think so. They possibly just don't know. I mean, not just to say there might be some cultures or some people you meet that have a sense of that because their own culture has a version of what I'm talking about. But I suppose it's being in Australia, there's a specific context to it because of the colonial, the history of colonialism in Australia, and that also plays into this.
Yeah. And there's more than one experience of this, of course, which is you were alluding to in talking about people who might present information in a particular way because of their connection to the stolen generation or their experience of it.
Yes.
Is there a deeper level of understanding amongst various mobs?
Yeah, there certainly is. Again, I was reflecting on this because I knew the interview was coming up. The lack of... You might criticise someone who's not around because they're big noting themselves or whatever, possibly, that there's that does definitely go on. But you don't do it in a way that destroys them, or there's a level of acceptance because they are part of the broader mob in relation to what you were saying.
Well, circling back, I did want to ask you, and I forgive me if I'm asking rude questions, but I could imagine, for me, I imagine a great sense of loss when people don't look for those contextual features that would be important to you as your personal identity. Is there a feeling? What is the feeling that you have when you move from one situation where people are looking for those relational contextual features and you walk into another context where those relational features and contextual features are robbed from you because no one thinks to look for them?
It can be that feeling of loss, I suppose. You don't feel comfortable and don't necessarily know who you are in that context. But it also can be because you can hide within that as well.
I hope we're not steering too far off your chapter, because I'm really fascinated in the fine-grained experience of that liminality and these ambiguities that can be experienced in different contexts. And you certainly draw on some really interesting theorists throughout your chapter, Simone de Beauvoir and a few others. What theorists have you found really constructive to work with in articulating these issues?
Well, definitely de Beauvoir, and probably Sartre, but also in terms of Indigenous theorists, definitely Coulthard. Yeah, I think...
Coulthard worked with Michael Taussig, or...?
No. So he's Dene, and it's just that he also brings in Frantz Fanon. So there's a whole series of historical theorists that all of this can relate back to, that I think we can't lose sight of, because, some people go out of fashion. Fanon certainly went out of fashion, but I still think he's incredibly relevant to what we're talking about today, and colonialism and how it's impacted First Nations people. So, Yeah.
And you work on quite an array of legal issues and power structures as well. And Frantz Fanon would speak to that really powerfully. How has he empowered the vocabulary to discuss these issues?
I think he offers the opportunity to see it from an insider's perspective. That's the most important aspect of it, I think. And I know that you can, and Coulthard does, critiques him because he actually falls back into playing the card of what white people might like to think of where black people are positioned in terms of power structures. But that he also, because he's an insider, he's able to offer, that exactly what I was talking about before, that inside perspective that only people who experience it know about. It's not an analysis from outside. And I suppose that's what's... And even though Simone de Beauvoir is obviously not any of these things, is just, but she is a woman, I suppose, and so she had such an insight just into how people relate to each other, and I think that's why I've really valued her, her analysis and how I've interpreted it in my chapter.
You've married Frantz Fanon and Simone de Beauvoir's work really nicely there, in the sense that it can help elucidate sort of the intersectionality between gender and race in experiences like the Australian experience of Indigenous people.
Yes,
as well.
Yes, exactly. And I think we don't necessarily give that enough credit, the crossing over of different theorists, because they're in a particular school of thought or whatever, and we lose sight of, as anthropologists possibly, of what insights we can gain from understanding those, again, perhaps the intersections between how people theorise about human beings and sociality.
Now, I recognise that as an anthropologist, I'm a little bit more sensitive to the issues that we're talking about than people who have not had some anthropology training. And so if I could ask you a question to prompt people to understand the connection between understanding these fine-grained experiences of liminal ambiguity and the import these understandings can have for when you're tackling some of the big court case issues that you've undertaken in your work. Can you connect the dots for us from understanding what it means to navigate two worlds, and then bring that into the court context where you're looking at all sorts of legal issues, from family law to native title?
I think the trick is, if I can put it that way, is to use the creativity of what that allows. So to be creative in articulating cultural meaning within a sort of colonial context, which is the court, really. It is a colonial construct. So how do you... but within that space where people actually want to improve people's lives, how do you articulate that? And I think it's from the personal... gives you insight into how someone may be operating, like a kid may be operating with that, and how they feel about the situation they've been put in, when, say, it's a criminal case, and then having some understanding of that from being an Aboriginal person. How do you articulate that back out into the wider colonially constructed legal system to make sense of it, so that these people then have an opportunity to get the best outcome?
Where you've brought me to with everything you've been saying has really highlighted to me that we're asking the wrong questions. Maybe we're not asking the questions the right way. What questions do you think we should be asking?
In the legal context?
Yeah, bridging both these spaces.
Oh, gee, that's really hard. I'm not sure if I can actually answer that, to be honest. That's really...
But shouldn't we be asking the hard questions though, right?
Yeah, true. True.
If we haven't got the questions right, then clearly we need to go back to the drawing board, I think.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to answer that one.
Can I rephrase it? What about if I was to ask you, what have been the most fruitful questions you've asked? Yeah, in your work, what has been a moment where you've asked a question?
Well, I suppose that way I approach, say, maybe that's it, but the way I approach if I'm doing a family court report, I don't necessarily ask about the kinship system or who's your mother, who's your father or whatever. I don't come at it from that perspective. That'll come out. I already know that will eventually come out. So what I ask about is more about, where's the child, who's the child staying with? Why does it upset you that this has happened? Those sorts of more, you might think of other people might think are more so sort of a psychologist might ask, or a, social worker, but that's not my purpose in that. It's more just to bring out those other, where's everyone fit and what's the cultural meanings about why you actually would prefer the child to, and why it's culturally imperative for the child to stay with the auntie rather than the father's family, as an example. So why is that more important, and how does that operate in the everyday? And then from that, then the kinship answers will come as part of that, but I don't start from that position. So that's more the creative aspect of it, I suppose, is what the creative aspect of it, that comes when I actually try and write this up, to try and then imagine how I tell that story accurately according to kinship understandings.
It seems to me that sometimes the direct approach is not necessarily the most fruitful approach, and
yes.
that a more circumlocutory approach, a circuitous route, is going to more organically reveal the information we need, but not just in terms of having facts on a page, but also facts that are contextualized and enriched by a deep understanding.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and that's the creativity aspect of it.
Yeah, great.
And I think that's how I approach the chapter 2. That's what Simone de Beauvoir actually offered me, is a way to be creative, because I actually think she's really brilliant personally.
In a previous episode, I'm just doing a little segue to a previous episode where I interviewed a family law specialist from Australian National University. And I want to distinguish this interview from that interview, because in talking about a child being looked after by its father's family, you're not talking about a father being a lesser important role. You're talking about the father's aunts and brothers and sisters, and the way in which the child is understood within a kinship network.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So we're not. No, that's all right. It's just that having done that interview now makes me realize we're talking about the kinship system. We're not talking about the value of one parent over another.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So I hope
it's the kinship system that determines the value in any case, because it gives for say the aunties have more, in this situation that I'm actually thinking of, the example I'm thinking of, the maternal aunties had more cultural right, if I can put it that way, to raise this young child at least till she was about 16.
Okay.
So that it's
that might look different in different situations. Is that correct? Or
yes, I suppose it depends on which culture you're talking about. Yeah. Which Aboriginal culture.
Yeah.
But
or which mob? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Yes. So it is. Yes. That's the difference between what you were just talking about and what I'm trying to articulate. Yeah.
Suzi, it's been a real pleasure to be talking with you, and thank you so much for your frankness and your willingness to answer questions that I know may have been treading on the wrong side of politeness. And I thank you for your generosity and your time, but also in your willingness to share this really interesting perspectives on liminal ambiguity.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity.
And thanks for joining us on Idioms of Normality, part of Future Framed TV, the collective podcast series of Traces&Dreams.